Welcome to the Faith Talks Wood podcast. I'm Will from Flat Woodworks.
And I'm Tom from Mountain Valley Maker.
And we're a podcast that talks about everything from Jesus to joinery and a little bit of everything in between. Tom, as you know, this past week, people got to hear your pretty voice because I was down for the count, man. I had some sort of respiratory thing. It wasn't Rona. It wasn't the flu. It tested negative for both of those. But man, it was a rough week. Started out Saturday night. I kind of felt a little bit cruddy, took some emergency, the vitamin C stuff, got through church and got home. And then our church had a men's sportsman shoot. So everybody brought it was all small caliber, 22-17, 22 mag, that kind of thing.
Nice.
And so everybody would come out and we're shooting, and I'm sitting there in between rounds, and I'm just like, oh, I'm feeling pretty crappy. And then got home. Luckily, it's 5 minutes from my house, and I told my wife, I said, I'm not feeling too hot. And I ended up going to bed by like 7:30 that night, just with cold chills, body aches. And then that just started the downhill journey from there. And the worst of it was probably Wednesday morning, which was funny because Tuesday night I was going to record, but the cough was really bad. And so I said, man, I'm just going to have to push off this week. And I felt pretty good. My wife and I watched an episode of our show. We just kind of relaxed Tuesday night. And then I woke up Wednesday. I thought I was going to die. I mean, the room was spinning. I had a horrible headache, felt nauseous. And ended up going to the doctor, and they tested me for all the stuff, and it came back negative. And he's like, man, well, you've got a pretty bad ear infection now. It probably came from whatever you got there earlier this week. And then they put me on antibiotics, and they gave me this cough stuff. It was like these capsules for cough. It did nothing but make me drowsy. It didn't stop the cough. It was horrible. So I stopped taking them. I'm like, this is dumb. And the antibiotics, while they worked, they also tore up my stomach.
Yeah.
And it's the quick, like the 5-day antibiotic. And it's like the super powerful thing, pills the size of a Mini Cooper.
Yeah. Zithromycin probably, right? Z-Pack, zithromycin. Yep. Yeah.
That's what that was. And so, had that going, and finally done with that. I feel good. Still have a little bit of a cough, but, man, it's been a rough week. As one of our brothers told me on Instagram, first the cease and desist with the business, and then the sickness. The devil's really trying to get at me, and I felt that this past week. So, Tom, how have you been, man?
And I have been busy on the farm, but I have gotten so much done in the last week. It just feels good to get it done. And I typically, I always take Sunday off and don't do woodwork and don't do any work on the farm and just come home from church and relax. But on Saturday, I needed to do a burn, and it was windy. Man, the wind was just howling, so it just wasn't safe to burn all the tree limbs that I had been cutting down and piled up. But I got home from church yesterday, and the weather was just perfect. There was no wind. And I told my wife, it's like, I want to get this stuff done. So I went out there yesterday afternoon and got all that. Every single limb that I've cut out of the tree is now burnt. And the big stuff is put in our, fire stack for winter. But I woke up, but just typically on Sunday afternoon, I do something fun, like go for a bike ride. If it's winter, we go snowboarding or, whatever the case might be. And I was like, man, I've got to go get outside. So I got up this morning. I told my wife, I'm going to go for a short hike. We have a trail close by called the Palisade Rim Trail. And there's two parts to it. There's the lower loop and then the upper loop. And I've only done the lower loop. I hadn't done the upper. And so the lower loop is a 4-mile hike. So it takes about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe an hour and a half, depending upon how much I stop and sightsee. But I got to the split, and I was like, I want to see what the upper trail's like. And I've never hiked it, and I didn't know how long it was. Dude, I hiked 13 miles this morning.
Wow.
It was fantastic. I mean, I had the whole trail to myself until a little over halfway through, and I ran into this older lady. She must have been 70, 75 out there hiking. And so she talked my ears off for about a mile or two there. But other than that, I had the whole trail to myself. It was just absolutely gorgeous. And but it took me about 4 hours to hike 13 miles. It's a pretty steep hike.
Yeah.
And but yeah. So that's
Now, isn't it out that way? Isn't it dangerous for a lady because like mountain lions and stuff? Or do you guys not have that in Colorado?
Oh, we have them.
Okay.
Yeah, but you know, it's. I mean, we have black bears. We have you know, coyotes, everything.
Right.
But you know, you can have a heart attack sitting on your couch, or you can go out and enjoy nature and take a chance on a bear or lion. You know, so
fair enough.
Yeah. But
awesome.
I've not seen. I've seen pictures, people showing me on their webcam, you know, their hunting cams and stuff of mountain lions. I mean, there's some big cats up here. I personally have not ran into him, but I know other hikers over on another part, not right here where I live. A guy got attacked by you might have seen it on the news. He got attacked by a mountain lion when not a mountain lion, a bobcat, when he was hiking. And he fought the bobcat and ended up able to strangle the bobcat and survived the whole thing. Rather than the bobcat killing him, he killed the bobcat with his bare hands.
That's like a movie.
I was like,
is that Revenant? Is that what that's called?
Revenant, yeah.
Revenant, yeah.
The Revenant, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool, man. Well, before we get into our guests, I just want to say thank you to the patron supporters. You guys are awesome. You guys are killing it over there. If you want to be a patron supporter, you can do so on patreon.com/Faith Talks Wood. And then get over on Apple and give us a 5-star review. It seems to be that all you guys are listening on iPhones. And so give us a 5-star review. That goes a long way. And then pray for the podcast. You know, this podcast is for him and his glory, and prayers go a long way in that. And so, Tom, today's guest, I've been listening to his podcast for a long time and discovered it, I don't know how many years ago, as I started working out in the shop and stuff and needed something to listen to. And I heard him say at one point something about going to church or being at church or doing something at church. And I'm like, huh. And so it's always been in the back of my mind. And so when we were, booking guests and stuff, Huy was one of the first ones that I thought of. And so without further ado, Huy Huyhn, the Alabama woodworker. Huy, welcome to the podcast, sir.
Hey, Will. Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me on something that is very near and dear to my heart, although it's not something that I often openly talk about. But I'm one of those weird Christians that I live. I try to live my life through Christ, but when folks approach me and ask me about my life, that's when I sort of typically open up about where my faith is and what I put my faith in. It's not something that I guess I proselytize a lot, and that's something that I'm struggling with and working on and trying to be better about. But I try to live my life through the example of Jesus Christ the best that I can. Do you mind if I go ahead and go into my testimony? Is that cool,
go ahead, man. We're excited to hear it.
Yeah. It's something exciting something that I enjoy talking about as well. So I came to this country as an immigrant. My family's from Vietnam. I actually was not born in the United States, although my lack of any form of accent and very non-regional talking would probably convince you that, no, that's straight up American. Well, I am American. I came here when I was 2.5. We escaped from Vietnam on a boat. So we were considered the quote unquote boat people. Right. And we spent time at a refugee camp in the Philippines, and it was through Catholic Charities, I'm sure you're familiar, that sponsored us. We were sponsored by a Polish, Italian, American family that were in their 70s when they, quote unquote, adopted me. My mother, being a divorced mom in Vietnam and a single mom in America, worked as a seamstress and for dry cleaners she still does, actually. She actually owns it now. Wink, wink. But I came to America, and my mom, being a single mom, working 2 jobs at the time, both at a Vietnamese restaurant in the evenings and at the dry cleaners during the day, I was unofficially adopted by my Polish, Italian, Catholic, American adopted family or sponsor family. They adopted me. Again, they were in their 70s. So I had kind of an old school upbringing, very traditional Catholic upbringing. I was 18 when I moved out. And so up until 18, I had a very, very Catholic upbringing, altar boy, all the things. And again, I've said this many times, and I do believe it, that there are many Catholics that are Christians. So let's just to know where I am coming from is that I do believe there are many Catholics that do put their faith solely in Jesus Christ and are Bible believers, and that's a wonderful thing. I was not one of them. I put my faith in my works. I believed that if I did good, that would put me in good favor with God. And can I tell you that set me up for a lot of success? I am very much, Tom, you being in the military, you understand SOP, structure, right? I thrived off of structure. I thrived off of do this, go and do this on Sunday. You will do good. You listen here. You do this. You will do good. And I thrived off of that. And I did everything my parents told me. I did everything that my adopted mother told me. Again, very traditional household. I had fear not in the Lord. I had fear in consequences. I did not fear God. I feared consequences. And so therefore, if I did good, then I would not reap the wrath of any consequences. And I did good. The problem is I was sinful. The problem is that I wanted to live by the flesh. The problem is that I was addicted to drugs. I was addicted to alcohol, and I was doing things as a high schooler and as a college student that so long as I could put on the facade of being good, I could get away with it. And I did. And maybe from a cursory sort of outlook, I was a good person. And I think most people would say that. And even today, I would probably say in my worldly view of things, I was a good person. For the most part, I was law abiding, other than, doing the mischievous stuff that I did with drugs and alcohol through college. And again, see, I'm still making excuses, right? Even being a believer. So went through college, again, did all the things I was supposed to do. Went to a great school, went to a school in Nashville called Vanderbilt, graduated with a bachelor's degree. Don't pump your fists. Their football team's terrible. Okay. They might be doing a little bit better this year.
I lived in Nashville, so that's
Yeah, I love Nashville. So
actually Murfreesboro. I won't even claim Nashville.
Right on. So went to school there. Still very lost. Graduated. Didn't know what the heck I was going to do. And my Christian friend Zach Wingard, I still remember him. Zach Wingard says, you need to go to Huntsville. NASA's in Huntsville. I've got an internship with Huntsville. They're paying for my graduate school. They'll pay for yours. You should come with me. So, but mind you, at this point, I did not apply to any graduate school. So I moved to Huntsville. I'm walking the halls. I'm introducing myself to professors and talking to them. And I got a professor to accept me into their graduate program. I worked for NASA for about 3 years under their graduate program. Got a master's degree. Fell in love with a girl in Atlanta, moved to Atlanta, lived in sin, lived with her, doing the married thing, but not married. That didn't work out. Moved back to Huntsville, got a full-time job in Huntsville as an aerospace engineer, and met my wife. And my wife is the one that actually called me out on all my stuff. She was very much in love with me, and I was very much in love with her. But her thing was that she told me is that I cannot participate in a relationship with you because I know you do not believe. And I was so upset with her. Like I said, how dare you think that I'm not good enough for you? And so we kind of had a little bit of falling out, not because we were in an argument with each other, but it was just healthy because she basically said, you need to figure things out. Like I cannot be a part of this. You need to get right with God. So I went on my search and got right with God. And it was actually because my wife had invited me to an Easter dinner that a pastor from Southeast Asia who was retired and coming to, or a minister, missionary from Southeast Asia, Patrick Delaney, was here in Huntsville visiting. He actually ended up moving here and pastoring a church here. He was there at Easter dinner, and he himself had gone through a background of Mormonism, Catholicism, all the isms, and ultimately landed as a follower of Christ. And so he had mentored me. We had devotionals, and it was in 2011 that I had asked God to take away my sins, to redeem me, to wash me clean. And it was in 2011 that Christ had saved me. I had never had the intention to get into a relationship with my wife. At that point, I thought, hey, you know what? Well, obviously, you know the story. I got married to my wife. But ultimately, because I had gone sort of my separate ways from her, somehow we had reconnected. And the way we had reconnected is Patrick Delaney and I were doing our weekly devotional at that point. Mind you, for a couple months now, I had not been talking to my wife at the time, Whitney. And it was me and Patrick walking through Bridge Street Town Center, which is an outdoor mall. During our devotional, we had walked from the cafe to another place that we were going to inside the mall, and family friends of my wife's had seen us walking by and was very shocked to see Pat Delaney, who was their pastor, the family friend's pastor, and me, who was a love interest to my wife. And they found that very odd that we were walking together, Bibles in hand, doing devotional time together. So they told my wife. My wife the next day called me and says, "What are you doing walking with Pat?" And I says, "Well, just figuring stuff out. Well, why do you ask?" And she's like, "Well, what are you figuring out? What's going on?" It's like, "Well, we're just talking about God and faith and what it all means, and what happens to us after we die and those sorts of things, and where what is this it for us? Is Earth it for us? We're just talking about stuff." And she's like, "All right, well, we started talking again, and we started dating, and we got engaged, and we got married, and now, by golly, 10 years later, we got 3 kids." So
amazing how that happens, ain't it?
yeah, so we're multiplying officially multiplying. When you got 3, you're multiplying. One for one, that's just a replacement.
Right.
And so to tie that all up to woodworking in terms of how it matters in woodworking, about 2 years, actually the first year of our marriage, my wife, we bought a fixer upper because I'm very frugal, and the markets are crazy, right? So I bought a fixer upper, and that was a foreclosure, and there's plenty to do. And one of the things that my wife wanted was a hall tree. She wanted a piece of furniture to hang up coats, put shoes, things like that. And me being the ego driven person that I am, says, we're not going to buy something. I can make it. I mean, we bought a fixer upper. I've been doing everything around the house. I can make this. Well, that went down a long rabbit hole of doing this project at a community workshop and learning all about tooling and all about woodworking and all about tolerances and all this stuff. Mind you, I'm an engineer, so I geek out on this kind of thing anyway, right? And yeah, 10 years later, I'm still doing it. So yeah, it's
That's
because
awesome.
my wife wanted a piece of furniture that I thought I could do better and for cheaper, which, by the way, while it might be better, it's definitely not cheaper.
Definitely not. Never is.
No,
Never.
no, never is.
But
Boy, man, that's awesome. So you quite the testimony of how it took a woman to kick you kind of down in a way to say, okay, what is this life about, right? And
right.
and get to meet with pastor and doing all that. And so so you guys are involved in a church now. You guys are members of a church, what, non-denominational or?
Yeah, it's non-denominational. So to sort of understand its origins, it is a church that's rooted under an or it was planted through Acts 29. Are you familiar?
Yep, Pastor Matt Chandler.
Yep, Matt Chandler. We grew from another church called Summit Crossing Madison, and so our church is Summit Crossing Limestone. But the names are a little bit confusing, right? You would assume that with the same name, Summit Crossing Limestone, Summit Crossing Madison, that you would assume that it's under the same plurality of leadership. That is not the case. These are two separate churches with two separate groups of elders that function separately completely. It is literally a plant that said, go forth, right? Like we have no authority over you. We trust that, we're going to plant the seed and you guys are going to be your own church. So while we partner with Summit Crossing Madison a lot, we are a completely separate church. And so we've actually talked about maybe the name is a little bit confusing because folks might think that they're actually one in the same church, but we're not. We're a totally separate church with its own leadership, but we are in cahoots, right? Like we are both Bible believing churches, and under very similar structure, but the leadership does not cross paths. Like we don't have one pastor for both churches, which I know some churches do. We have a whole separate pastor, whole separate, elders and deacons and all that stuff. Right. So leadership. So
very good. Now I see the keyboard in the back. Are you musical?
So my wife is the pianist. She's actually plays on the worship team.
Okay.
I run sound for the worship team. I also do and we can get a little bit more into that. I used to run sound. We've come into some hardships, and that I think that kind of ties into what's going on in the shop, which I'd like to talk a little bit about later, or maybe might be a perfect segue. But we've had to sort of step back a little bit in terms of our involvement with church, not because there's anything wrong with church, but we've come under some really heart heavy things with our family that my wife has had to deal with, and many blessings that have come from it, and we are sort of on the other side of it, but it's something that's going to affect us for the rest of our lives. And very, very big tragedy in our lives that has affected my woodworking and made me kind of step back and think a little bit about how woodworking it still fits into my life, and if it fits into my life. Okay. I think it does. So let's not be dramatic here. I still think it does. It's just, I think because of what's happened recently, I've been thinking a little bit more clearly about what sort of matters right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Things. Yeah,
you're more than. Yeah, if you want to talk about any of that, you can. You don't feel obligated to. That sounds similar to us when we started having kids. I didn't grow up with a strong father figure family around, and so it's very important for me to be involved. Mm-hmm. And so I get, if I get an hour of shop time every other week, I'm lucky. But that's by design. It's not woe is me, because for me the priority is my 4-year-old and my 18-month-old, right?
Right.
And so I understand the seasons of life and how you have to kind of pivot and, decide what's important. And I work 45 minutes away. And so I'm gone a lot and I work a lot. And so I do have to balance that myself some, but But yeah, okay, yeah, very good. So I'm a drummer. I've been playing drums for 25 years, and so I see music. I'm like, oh, music, geek out.
Yeah, yeah. I very much like music. Actually, my wife and we met dancing. So I don't know if folks on my podcast necessarily know this, but I've been dancing for longer than I've been woodworking. I've been partner dancing, Lindy Hop, swing, jazz,
Really?
Charleston, Balboa, blues. Yeah. So I've been doing that for about 23 years. And there was a good portion of my life when I was in, actually when I was in Atlanta, but also in Huntsville and in Nashville, that I was teaching on a semi-regular basis, teaching dance semi-professionally. I still kind of do that, but my wife and I have sort of stepped back as much from the dancing side of it. And we host, or excuse me, from the teaching side of it, we host a monthly dance. So once a month, we host a dance. Sometimes we have a live band. I have sound equipment. Like I said, I love music and I love running sound. So I have sound equipment and stuff. And so sometimes we host a live band. Sometimes we host like traveling bands. But it's uniquely swing and uniquely traditional jazz. So think like Louis Armstrong and
absolutely
Billie Holiday and Chick Webb and Duke Ellington and Count Basie. Think of those types of artists from like the 20s to about the very early 50s is really sort of the music genre that we dance to.
Oh man.
And that's something that probably my wife and I will do until the rest of our lives. In fact, actually, my wife teaches for a Christian-based ballet studio called Adonai School of Ballet. I mean, this is an amazing studio. I can't talk about it enough. It's the most beautiful dancing I've ever seen. And it's not like, sometimes you see sort of like Christian and faith-based things and you're like, well, that's nice, but like, it's maybe not as like clean or as like because it's more sort of worship forward. Well,
Right.
We're talking about a ballet studio that's very worship forward, but also very, very structured around technique. And the owner of the studio, who fell in love with Whitney and her teaching style, is very much based on the Russian ballet method. And so they are very, very, very stringent about proper technique. And some of these girls that have come through have gone on to become professional dancers, like not just like, faith-based dancers, but like pro dancers. So this is
wow.
very, very good school my wife works for. So that's sort of another ministry that my wife is involved in. Something that I'm trying to figure out myself is how the woodworking works in with faith and service. Something I'm kind of struggling with right now. I've done a number of projects for faith-based companies. So I made a conference table with the company's logo and their nonprofit logo epoxy inlaid into their table. It's called Mission Driven Research, and their nonprofit is called Mission Driven Ministries. And I've done work for them. I've done work for another company called Sycamore, which is freelance physicians, but it is a faith-based company. And so there are a couple of things that I have done, but really what I'm trying to sort of figure out is how can I help other men, particularly men, because I have a connection there with, I think woodworking just tends to be more male centric. Not that would ever be against, ministering to women. It's just sort of the nature of our craft. Right. So I would like to try to tie my woodworking into something with faith and service and really giving back to younger men in some way, because I can see how that could be a huge benefit. I just don't know how yet, and I'm trying to figure that out.
Now, Brian and Guy work for an organization that, in a way, they work with men in woodworking, right? I don't
purely
know
men, specifically former convicts and former drug addicts. And it is a faith-based organization. They're very strict. They have to be because of the environment that they're in.
Right.
Ex-convicts, drug addicts, that sort of thing. So they don't mess around. They get a lot. There's a lot of turnover. but there's a lot of benefit if you stick with the program. And it is a program. It is not just like they get paid, but they cannot slip up. And it is a very, they have like a 30-minute devotional every day. They have prayer in the morning. They work for schools. It's a nonprofit. So everything is either donated to the organization, and then everything goes back out to either schools and other faith-based organizations, or it goes out to the workers, the men that need the help, right? So the idea is purely we're teaching you a life skill. We're teaching you how to live life through Christ. We're teaching you how to take accountability for your own actions and for your own successes and your own failures. Very, very strict. Yeah, it's PD Indy. But I mean, you as an individual could go to PD Indy and say, hey, I want 5 tables, and they'll build it. But all the profits that they make go towards either PD Indy or back into the community or back into the workers themselves that are seeking better lives for themselves through Christ.
Yeah, there's a ministry in Nashville called Narrowgate, and Narrowgate, it's not geared towards like convicts and ex-drug addicts and stuff, but it's geared towards men. You go through a very intensive program, and when you come out, there's 3 aspects of the business. They have a coffee business. They make coffee. They have a leather business. They do leather working. Bible rebinding is their big thing. And then they have a woodworking shop. And so that's where I've gotten 2 Bibles rebound from them, and it's super cool stuff. But man, that's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to follow on that journey with you of how you can, how you end up using your abilities for the kingdom,
Yeah. I tend to be a natural teacher. I'm pretty good at that. Dance instructor. I've done lectures. I do presentations on a weekly basis. So I tend to be a very good instructor. I think I'm sort of natural at that. So I'd like to do that. Again, I'm just trying to figure out how to do that, because in today's society, there's liability on everything.
Oh yeah.
And you just got to be careful. And, the devil's out there to get you, man, and ruin you. So like, I'm trying to figure that out. But right now it's, so maybe to go into what's going on in the shop. So about 6 months ago, we had gotten the tragic news that my wife's brother, who she was very close with, they grew up in a family of 5 kids. My wife's the second youngest, and they were all homeschooled. So, homeschool group, homeschool families, they're tight,
Right.
We do everything together. He had died in a tragic motorcycle accident at the age of 37. JAG officer. I mean, you want to talk about the model of success, right? And how life can just go out of this world in a matter of a second, right? 37 years old, JAG officer, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, highly decorated, working for a very, very prominent lawyer partnership here in Huntsville, was going to, after a few years, start a branch of the firm in Nashville. I mean, this is how much trust and how much potential this company saw in him as a law firm, and to get that taken away in an instant. And that just completely rocked our world. Like, it turned us upside down. And one of the biggest and hardest things that I had to sort of realize is that I, as a mere mortal, as a man, while it is just bred into us, is like, well, you need to be the everything to your wife, and your wife needs to be the everything to you. And there was nothing that I could say or do that could help with the pain that she was feeling. And it was so debilitating to me and so emasculating to me to think that, like, I cannot take that pain away from my wife. Um, and it was in the middle of me trying to finish this china cabinet that I'd been working on for almost a year at that point. And I almost gave up. I almost did not, I was willing to pay back the materials that I had bought for this china cabinet. Mind you, I was like three quarters of the way done at this point. It's a beautiful china cabinet, probably the best piece of furniture I've ever built. And I do commissions based on what I want to build, not on the fact that I need to do it. If I do a commission, it's because I want to do it. It's not because I need to do it. I'm a full-time aerospace engineer. I live comfortably. I'm very happy with my career. I have a great job. So any commissions that I take on, it's taken on because I have a desire to do that job for this person. This was a wonderful job. The client was absolutely magnificent. But about 3 quarters into it, I thought about giving it up. I actually thought about giving up woodworking altogether because of the amount of pain that we were dealing with. And just at that time, we also had a 1-month-old. So when all this went down, we had a 1-month-old, our third child. So we just got put through the ringer, and there were some, birth issues with, with my newborn, and like we were dealing with that. And it was just so much that I just felt so helpless. And it's like, how can I even go out into the shop when my wife is absolutely, completely devastated and my children need me? And my 1-month-old, is put into this harness because her hips didn't develop properly. And I'm thinking, it's like, God, what are you trying to tell me something? Like, what's going on here? Do I need to just quit, and just give this up and forget about it and just, pay the money that I have in the wood for this woman and just say, hey, I can't do it. I got through it. It was extraordinarily difficult to finish and to get through. And it was one of the pieces. It's the first time I've ever felt this way, that I actually felt like I had given up a part of myself into this piece. And I'm really happy that it was done. I was just very happy that I had finished it when it was done. But the past 6 months has really made me think a lot about my mortality, and a lot about what really is important in this world. And no, I'm not trying to be melodramatic. I didn't quit woodworking. And so, I'm still doing it. But it very much is a step back. And I'm not against doing projects of that size. But I think I just need to have a very clear mind of what is important, and to just be able to step away from something and not be so committed into something that could possibly take away from the most important things in my world, right? The things that God has put me in charge of, right? Which is taking care of my wife, making sure that she's, properly taken care of, and my children, making sure that they grow up to know the Lord. I took a vow that the first and most important disciple in my life is my wife, and the second are my children. That is a vow that I had taken. And I could feel myself slipping away from that, because of how helpless I felt during that time. Yeah. So that was the last 6 months have been quite the ringer, but it's a relief, right? I mean, praise God, we've gotten through it. And we've had to step away from, my wife playing for worship, and me volunteering for sound. We've had to step away a little bit, but we are slowly getting back into we're getting back into our small group. Our small group has been great. They have lifted us up in so many ways, which most importantly, the food has been amazing. Can I say that much? It's like, man, our small group is, wow, man, they'll feed you, man. That's one thing about small groups. They'll feed you real good, you know?
Absolutely. That's what it's about, man.
It's like, we'll fill that stomach some way. You won't feel the pain. You might feel full, but you won't feel pain.
Well, here's the thing though. The reality of a small group, and I'm a huge proponent of small group, is that in those times, I don't know how big your church is, if it's 100 people or 1,000 people or whatever, but like that small group is going to be the crutch, right? The meals that you and your wife did not want to think about making, you didn't have to, because they were there beside you and said, you know what, if there's anything we can do, we can give you a meal on your table. And so it's so important to have that small group.
And I definitely have. So we step back a little bit, but I've missed it so much. You know, I missed our small group because we hadn't attended in a little while. We're getting back into it. So on a regular basis now. Thank God for that. That He's given us the power to come back and maintain our faithfulness.
Absolutely.
But I'm like you, Tom. I love digging into scripture, particularly the historical narrative. That's like my favorite. I love the historical narrative so much because when you get into, we're in First Samuel, by the way, right now. And it is like my eyes of like how weak Saul was and how, you know, he disobeyed God and all the things, all the opportunities that he had to just put his faith in God, and that he just squandered them. And even when he knew he was going to be destroyed, he was like, well, I still don't want it, so let me go my way. And there was still an opportunity for him to repent and to surrender to God. He still didn't. And then even David, right, who was chosen by God, who pillaged his own people, right? The surrounding areas, who pillaged the surrounding areas, who was, for the most part, had done evil things. Still, God provided grace and mercy upon him to be the chosen for Israel, right? It all that historical narrative is just so fascinating to me. And it's probably because I'm a geek and an engineer. But man, that is one thing that I really miss, was digging into the word with our small group. And can I tell you, when I am digging in again, just to tie it back into woodworking and to our normal lives, I'm a better employee. I'm a better maker. I'm more creative. I think, and people think this is weird, but because I'm digging into that historical narrative, and by the way, I like it all, but really it's the historical narrative that really fascinates me. I become more creative. I'm more creative because I see how God is intertwined into everything and how it all goes back and is pointed towards him and his creation, right? All those things really do tie back to that. And it just makes me a better woodworker, a better employee, a better engineer. I'm more creative. I feel rejuvenated. I feel reassured about things. And I don't know why, but I am. And I know that because for the past 6 months where we were in a really bad slump because of what happened, and I wasn't digging in the word, I was just trying to stay afloat. My level of creativity and drive and motivation was just down the tubes in every way. My diet was terrible. Even when I was eating, well, I wasn't really eating much. But even the things that I was eating, it was just there was no sweetness to it. There was no salt. There was no flavor to it at all. Like I was just empty. And I couldn't get back to, well, I am now, but it was just so difficult to me. I was just like, let me just stay afloat. Let me just stay afloat. Let me just stay afloat. And during that time, I just hadn't been reading. I hadn't been digging in. And I just felt like I didn't have it in me. And part of that was I didn't want to know the truth of our own mortality. It scared me. And I knew that everything I was reading was, it all happens for a reason. This is all for a reason. And I didn't want to admit to that. I didn't want to admit that this tragic thing all happened for a reason. It's like, how could it? I don't understand, and I'm still trying to figure it out.
It's difficult as human beings when we only have an earthly perspective, because we haven't got into eternity yet. We haven't got into heaven. And, we're down here in this little speck, and God's up here, and he can see the speck and everything else that's around. And so he sees what we can't see. As like in Isaiah 55, where it talks about his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so ironically, you talked about your loss there. So I actually filmed my first YouTube video today, but it's not woodworking. I'm starting another channel, and it's all about making the most of today, because yesterday was 22 years since my dad passed away, and he was 51 years old. I'm 53 now, and just, man, like yesterday, it just hit me. It's like, man, what is it that I'm supposed to be doing now that I'm hesitating on, that I'm pausing on, that I'm prioritizing work, the farm, everything over, versus that's why I went for the hike this morning. 'Cause it's like, tomorrow's not promised. We don't know when that last day is for us. And so we've got to go out and enjoy today. And you talked about earlier about sharing the gospel and how you typically wait for somebody to ask you a question. I just finished reading a book called Gospeller by Willie Robertson, and the whole book talks about sharing the gospel one conversation at a time. But that's the very thing. Is like, am I going out and starting those conversations? What am I doing by working myself to death, every day in and out? But yeah, I'm 100% with you. When I'm in the Word, like, particularly like if I read it and then pray about it, it's like, okay, what are you trying to talk to me? Like, it sparks things in my mind, and my creativity just go to a whole different level. I think of things that would not normally think of. So, but
yeah, it's funny how that works. Even last week I was sick, and I've been reading the Bible every day. I don't know how, year and a half or 2 years into it now, but like 2 nights I didn't read the Bible because I was sicker than a dog. But I couldn't think about anything, and I could tell spiritually and mentally and physically, obviously I was sick, the weight of not reading the Bible, like not digging in. And so I'm even like finding myself like, oh my gosh, I got to get back into this. It's 2 days, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing how much that can throw you off kilter, and what that can look like when it becomes so important to us. And it's extremely important. Wade, you have the ESV Study Bible?
I don't have the ESV study Bible. I do actually use an ESV.
Okay. So
English
the ESV
version.
Study Bible, there, I have it on my nightstand over here. The way they intro books is very heavily historically narrative. It's really cool how they like what was going on at that time. Why is this important? Here's the narrative behind it. And so just a thought, as you were saying, I was like, oh, it's like the ESV Study Bible. When you read the intro to whatever book, it's breaking down that historic narrative. So
the ESV it's kind of it's not ironic, it's probably providential, but so we use, our church very much goes along the lines of giving a lot of context to whatever book we're digging into. And the version that we gravitate towards, although we don't exclusively just use it, we just tend to use it the most, is an ESV version. But I do like the New King James quite a bit. I kind of started my early Christian walk in the New King James version. This tend to be a little bit easier to read than the King James, obviously.
Absolutely.
But I do like the ESV as well quite a bit. I'll have to get the ESV study Bible.
It's a good, I like to use it for, I'm a big expository, like our church's expository teaching. So we go through whole books of the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And I'm big on I'm going to jump into a new book. Before I jump into that book, I want to know about the narrative behind it. Why is it written? Who wrote it? What's the history behind it? What's the context of that time period? And so ESV Study Bible does a fantastic job of kind of breaking that down. I'm a Bible translation nerd. And so I have 4 Bibles on my nightstand, and they're all different translations.
Very cool.
It's just I'm weird. Okay. That's
no,
you said it.
We dig into those things too. It's like there are certain words that, for whatever reason, this translation, left that term out, but it's kept in this. And some people get really wrapped up around the axle about that. We tend to not so we have certain sort of closed fist things and open hand things. It's like, hey, these are open hand things. So for instance, predestination or certain things, we're kind of, we are sort of towards a certain direction, but anybody that does not particularly ascribe to that sort of systematic theology, we're like, hey, cool. We want to break bread with you. We want you here. We want you to be part of the church.
Right.
But there are certain closed hand things, which you probably know what they are.
The deity of Christ.
Sure. Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's I would call that majors and minors.
Right.
And we minor on the minors and major on the majors.
Right.
And the majors are salvific.
Right. Exactly. You hit the nail on the. In fact, actually, I think that's part of our charter and our constitution, that you sign when you become a member, that hey, these are things that we are steadfast on. We will not budge on these things. And if you're cool with that, then we want you to be those sorts of things. Right.
Right. It's funny. I had Jehovah's Witnesses come to my house, and they don't know that I have a degree in the Bible and theology, and that I'm a nerd about this. And they said, we'd love to talk to you about an event we got going on. And I said, well, you don't believe in the deity of Christ, do you? And they're like, well, I said, well, we're going to be off on the wrong foot right there.
Yeah.
Dude, I had this Jehovah Witness, and he kept coming because he would come by, and they initially, they'll start off by opening a conversation and, just kind of ask you what you believe in. And he said, well, man, I'd love to come back by and sit down. Man, come on by. And so he comes by, and I said, well, let me grab my Bible. And so I took my Bible out on the front porch and said, have a seat in the rocking chair. I was like, where do you want to start at? Matthew?
Man. Matthew, that'll tell you the lineage and really break it down.
And,
I love it.
It's funny, man. But yeah. But
awesome.
That is why it's so important that we're in the Word. Right. Because if you're not in the Word and you don't know what the truth is, you can easily be deceived by what's not truth.
Right. Well, our pastor in Tennessee would tell a story about one of his best friends is in the FBI, and he had went the FBI office in Nashville, and he went to have lunch with him, and he went up to his office to meet him, and the FBI agent has a stack of $100 bills on his desk, and the pastor's like, what in the world do you do with all these $100 bills? He's like, well, in order for me to be able to know what a counterfeit is, I have to know the real thing intimately. Right. And the idea of how are you going to know if somebody's speaking truth if you don't know the Word, and if you don't understand and have those basic doctrines and that basic theology, even to just have the Spirit flush those things out. And so Really important stuff. So, man, it's been amazing. So, do you have anything in the shop right now that you're working on?
I put in a bid. I have a small thing. Well, I guess it's not too small, but it is 230 custom handles for a cabinet shop. That
I heard you say that on the podcast.
Yeah. So they're going to be made out of hickory. I didn't necessarily win the bid for it, but they had asked me to do it, and I said, okay, this is what I can do it for, and gave an estimate and whatnot, and they were fine with it. I'm still waiting. Excuse me. I'm still waiting for that cabinet shop to get the mahogany in their shop. It was just easier for them to order the same mahogany that they got than for me to order mahogany. Who knows, like, if it's even similar in color and whatnot. So if they're getting it from the same vendor, I'm just going to get it from them, from the cabinet shop that the family had hired to do the cabinets. They just don't have the manpower to do custom handles. Someone like myself that will maximize the system of producing those handles, is, me as an individual doing it, is a lot more efficient than them. A shop of 4 guys, mainly installers, doing something like that. So that's
So are you turning them? Is that the plan?
No. So they're going to be sort of a modern contemporary handle. So it's more like a lipped handle.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
With some shape and some rounds on it that lends itself to more of a modern look. So just sort of think like an L handle shape with a lot of rounds on it and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's very simple, but it's quite labor intensive. So there'll be threaded inserts and whatnot, very small threaded inserts. So I've got a couple of jigs that I'll be using so that I can center those inserts properly. I might use the CNC, but I don't know. I sort of feel like I'd be faster doing it through my other machine tools like table saw, router table, bandsaw, than using my CNC. I've got a pretty powerful CNC. It's borderline industrial. It's just on a smaller size and smaller scale. But it's my concern is waste, right? Because I know I can maximize my yield if I do it on my normal machine tools, which have much smaller curves. But when I'm using like even a 1/4 inch bit and I'm making the profile out for all the individual handles, there's a 1/4 inch of waste all around. So even just the width of one handle, I'm wasting a little more than a 1/2 inch because I've got to have some meat to mount the block of wood onto my CNC table.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I'm weary of that because I feel like that's going to cost the client easily 20 to 30% more in materials. And I'm just not comfortable with that. I'm just not comfortable charging that in waste when I know I have processes and machine tools at hand that minimize that waste. I mean, a bandsaw curve, right? 1/16 of an inch at most, right? And that's only on one side, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, I just can't justify the system of using a CNC as opposed to using my traditional machine tools. I think I'd rather use my traditional machine tools and minimize the waste.
And you said they're going to be out of mahogany?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
very good.
Yeah. So it's going to be pretty stuff. I'm kind of looking forward to it. It's going to be very repetitive, but I think I kind of need something a little bit mindless right now.
Absolutely.
Where I'm at, so.
What kind of CNC do you have?
So it's a custom made one. It's made by a CNC builder out in Seattle. So he had designed it with parts that he's found over the years to be reliable. It's a ball screw machine, 2-axis, dual rails for the X and Y and single rail for the Z. It's a pretty fast machine, but like it's definitely not industrial in its overall speed. But for what I do, I don't really need that.
Yeah.
So I'm not, I'm not making production cabinets, right?
Yeah.
But it goes as fast as I need it to go in any of the capacity of things that I would do.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. But
Very good.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said very good. That's cool.
Hey, this has been something that our pastor had put into a sermon that I think really could be for, however long, maybe another 5 or 10 minutes in terms of the podcast, but something that he had talked about with regards to godly desires versus worldly desires or man's desires. And it particularly pertains to Saul, because we were studying Samuel at our church. And something that really has made me think a lot about my desires. And one of the things that my pastor had said is that it's very easy, particularly for men that are very driven, that want to be successful, that want to provide heavily for their family, to confuse or conflate man's desires or your worldly desires for godly desires. And how does one individual, and I think this sort of ties into our woodworking, how does one decipher what is godly desire and my own selfish desire, my own ego, my own pride? How do we differentiate the two? And when we get off a track, how do we come back on track? And Will, Tom, maybe you can help me with that, because that's something I'm still trying to think through. And there are some things and some pointers that, our pastor had talked about, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And I think this ties into woodworking.
Well,
Yeah.
For me, it's a pretty easy answer. So I've been studying the Gospels. I'm on my 6th time reading through the Bible, and I just got into, I just finished up Mark today. But if you remember, before Christ got crucified, he went away and prayed 3 times. And,
right.
and each time, said, not my will, but yours. If you could take this cup from me, do,
Mm-hmm.
but your will. And I think in our society, and for me particularly, we are bombarded by technology, by our cell phones, by TV, by radio, by so much noise. And so, like today, that's kind of why I went for the hike. It was to go, and no technology. So like when I go out hiking or go paddleboarding or anything, it's just me out there with nature. And so I think going away from all the noise and praying, and you would be amazed, like if you're in the Word and then you go away and get away and really just sit and listen and talk to God and ask your answer. I've got a journal. And so when I'm struggling with something, I will ask a question, I'll write it down, and then literally just sit and quiet and wait, and then write down the thoughts of what comes to mind. And ironically, this laptop, this MacBook that I'm on here, when I was in the process of getting a new computer, I was praying about, I should pray about every little dollar purchase, but I always pray about major purchases. And so I was praying about, it's like, how much should I be spending? What size computer? And, and I still have it in my journal. God's like, get the most powerful thing that does more than what you need right now, but doesn't have to be at the top of the line. So I wrote that down. And I went to Mac's website and I'm looking at everything. I looked at the software that I was going to be running on the computer. And so figured out what's going to work now and then not have to be replaced for the next, 5 so years with the software and all. And when I looked at the computers, I instantly, because God told me, get the more than you need. Now, what do? My earthly desire, I was looking at top of the line one they had. And,
Right.
but then I had this uneasiness in my heart. Like it was like, this doesn't feel right. I don't have a peace about me. And so remember, when we go to the Father and he gives us answer, it says he will give us peace that surpasses all understanding. So if there's something that we're doing and we don't have a peace about it, that's the devil trying to distract us. That's not God's answer, because when you receive that answer from him, you are going to have a peace. And so I was like, well, Lord, I just don't have a peace. And he's like, keep looking. And so I kept looking. And so then I looked at the next one. And so I finally felt like, okay, this one that's $25.99 is more than meets my specs. It's everything I need, but it didn't have a peace about spending that much money. And I was like, Lord, I feel like this is the right one, but I don't feel comfortable spending this much money. And I was out on a walk and praying about it. And I was like, what should I do? He said, look elsewhere. And I said, well, how much should I be spending? And actually, I had asked, how much should I spend? He said $17.99. And I'm like, okay.
It's very specific.
so the funny thing is, so I came home that first day and from my walk, and I looked. There was not a laptop for $17.99 on Apple's website.
Right.
So the next morning I'm out walking. So this went on for about a week and a half or so, where I just kept praying about this one. And so on my walk the next morning, I was like, Lord, you said $17.99. I don't see a one for $17.99. He said, look elsewhere. And so I went to B&H's website. The same identical MacBook Pro that was on Apple's website was on sale on B&H for $17.99.
There you go.
Taking that time and getting away and shutting off where nothing is distracting you, praying about it. And just like Jesus did, he didn't go up there and pray one time. He went back and prayed again. He went back and prayed again. And so if we follow his example and continue to pray, continue to go off and be alone with the Father, he'll give you the answers and he'll give you the peace and the understanding. So,
yeah, I echo everything Tom said, because I think there's so much to getting away, so many distractions. I work in IT, man, and you're an engineer. You work with computers and around that kind of stuff. I live by email. Email is my the breath I breathe. My thing is trying to get on track and trying to stay on track and trying to, have the desires. First off is to go here.
Yeah.
Stay in the Word. Now, when I was thinking about that, that's why I ran over and grabbed Bible off my nightstand. So Paul in Romans 7, I do the things I don't want to do. The things I want to do, I don't want to do. He's battling, going back and forth with this, right? And then Romans 8, Paul says, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of spirit and life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. For what God has done what the law, weakness by flesh could not do. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh in order that righteousness, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on things according to the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. And then he goes on to say, you, however, are not in the flesh, but are in the Spirit. It's the idea of everything that I do has a lens of Scripture through it. I read my Bible. I study my Bible. I pray, ask God to indwell within me, ask his spirit to indwell within me. And the reality is that we as Christian men are attacked so much in this culture. Porn and the status symbol that you have to be big macho guy, and you have to have this model wife, and you have to drive this car and live in this subdivision, all this crap that I think pulls us away from who God really wants us to be. And so if we live within the spirit, we're living within life and peace. And so, my thing is not that, not that I try to live perfectly, because we can't, but that I try to discern everything with the Holy Spirit. Because the reality is that, your wife was homeschooled. I dated a girl that's homeschooled. My wife went to private school, basically homeschooled. There's this idea of like, and I live in Pennsylvania around the Amish. My neighbors are Amish, right? To not live in the world, to stay away, to abstain, to be away. The reality is we can't do that as Christians. We're called, Matthew 28, to go make disciples. And so as men, we can't abstain from the things of the world as far as living in the world, but we are to be insulated by the Holy Spirit. And once we're insulated by the Holy Spirit, when Satan attacks us, and when he tries to send these photos and put these photos past us on social media and divert our minds, we have the discernment of the Spirit, and we're insulated by the Spirit, in that we are not walking in the flesh. Because funny, you think you're funny, the devil, Satan, nah, God's got my back. And then the last thing I'll say, and I've talked about this on the podcast, Tom probably knows what I'm going to say. Anytime I've felt a desire that does not feel of God, whether that's lust or covetousness or whatever it may be, I audibly say, Satan, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to get out of my mind. And there hasn't been a time in a moment like that where it hasn't just happened. The power of the Spirit, I believe, is strong. It's mighty than ever. The gifts, the power of the Spirit didn't cease. He's here and alive today. And when we call on the name of Jesus, every knee will bow, and Satan's army will shudder at the name of Jesus. And so as we're trying to flee from these desires that aren't of God, just remind the devil on who your king is. And that's something that's worked for me, and that I've preached and taught to men for many years now.
But one thing, like with our woodworking, there are things that Christ put inside of us. He obviously put inside of you those skills to become a engineer and that type of mindset. The guy that's an amazing chef, he put those type skills in that person and crafted each of us differently. And so sometimes you might, like our woodworking, we might take what God put inside of us and what he wanted us to work on. And then, of course, we start adapting. Well, oh man, I need that fest tool. Oh man, I need that,
Right,
and we get off track of what, while he wants us there in the shop building things, then we can then turn it into a worldly desire. So I definitely think the skill set that you have and the beautiful piece, God is going to use woodworking and you in combination to do good, whether it's bringing young men to Christ, whatever. But I just pray about it and be in the Word about it, and he's going to guide you down that path for sure.
Amen. Thank you.
Awesome. Very good. Well, getting kind of late here. I'm Eastern. You're Central. Yeah, Alabama, you're Central time zone. Tom is Mountain. He's over there in
It's early here,
middle of
man.
nowhere.
It's dinner time.
But man, we really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Where can people find you on the socials and stuff?
I haven't been too active, although all my social medias are still active or still active. They still exist. I just haven't been very active on them. But just go to my website, alabamawoodworker.com. You can find all my links to my socials there. And of course the podcast, Woodshop Life podcast. You can hear what we have talking about. And that is strictly woodworking.
Yeah.
So
speaking of your podcast, I started listening to Woodshop Life. I want to say like around episode 43 or something like that, seems like. And I instantly was hooked, and I went back and listened to all the past. So I have literally listened to every single episode y'all have ever made, man. I love it. So
I do too.
tell Guy and Brian, you guys do a great job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, well, we appreciate it. Thanks for listening, guys.
Yeah. Do you ever, I have to ask, do you ever get like the same question and you've answered it before? Because I feel like I listen to your podcast and like I feel like, these guys have answered this before, right? It'd be like on joinery or a method or.
So we do, but what we try to ensure, and we've talked about this because we've talked about the fact that a lot of times folks are going to ask the same questions. But again, it kind of goes back to this historical narrative thing that I'm kind of obsessed about, that we've sort of talked about, like, hey, when these questions come up that seem to be repetitive, let's think of a story. Let's think of something that you've done and bring it back to now. A problem that you had, you thought about it, and then the solution or the lack of solution, but what you learned from it. So the idea that we try to adopt when we do have repetitive questions, which we are inevitably going to have because there's only so many things that you have to sort of tackle with woodworking, is that we try to bring it back to a narrative, historical narrative, telling a story of, here's the context. This is the problem that I encountered. Here's the context of that problem. This is how I thought about it. This was a solution, or how I failed and what I learned from it. So the idea that we always try to make is that make it a story, make it into something that when people listen, they'll be engaged other than just the normal facts that we have spewed off multiple times. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So before we go, can you give our listeners the 90-second history of how your podcast came to be? Because I don't know if I've ever heard the history of like, how'd you guys start?
So it was originally myself, Guy, and Sean.
Yep.
And we were three people that bounced. This was sort of the early stages of Instagram and the early stages of YouTube, and probably the first half dozen YouTube videos that Guy Dunlap had put out. And I felt like back then, it was very different, right? There were only a few YouTubers, but Guy's stuff was very academic and very sanitary. In other words, there was no flash. It was just, I'm doing this and this is how I go about doing it. And for whatever reason, I really gravitated towards what he was doing. The same with Sean. He was doing videos as well. And then when Instagram started, we all kind of connected. We knew each other, and it was sort of like all these early like YouTubers. I was not a YouTuber, but I commented and I had created a personal connection with Guy and Sean on a separate occasion, either by emailing them or messaging them, and they were always very responsive. And maybe it's because of me being just a very natural sort of instructor. It was very specific and very pedagogical in the way I asked questions and things that I asked about. So, for instance, he was doing something on a Sheraton desk, and I asked specifically about like the formula that he was using on one of his finishes. And I asked, like, I think I asked something along the lines of, do you put the shellac in the denatured alcohol, or do you put the denatured alcohol in the shellac? And how do you, like, have you looked at the differences between the two? And I guess for whatever reason, it's like, wow, that's a really specific question. And I can understand why you care about that. And he was like, I always put the shellacs in the denatured alcohol, because if I put the denatured alcohol in the shellac, what happens is that it all melts together and sticks to the bottom. It's harder to mix. I was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense. And that was kind of where I was going, is like, why is it this versus that? And so, again, it kind of came down to, I was just very specific in asking questions from Guy and Sean and whatnot. And we had built a relationship through Instagram, through YouTube, and ultimately a whole bunch of podcasts were popping up about woodworking. And we said, it's so much of it just revolves around like kind of banter. It's like, why don't we just do something that's just about woodworking and just about the struggles and the questions that come along in the life of a woodworker that's doing it as a hobby in a garage shop. And so we came up with Woodshop Life Podcast. And we always just said, we just want it to be about the task at hand, the woodworking. That's all it is. And, at the very end, maybe we just talk about 5-10 minutes really quick about what we're doing in our own shops. But really what we want is the questions from the audience and how that ties into our experience as woodworkers. It will naturally become a narrative because we're telling stories through the questions. And that's it. That's how.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Very similar. You guys saw a hole in the market as far as the podcasting like we did. And hey, let's fill this.
Have you ever, I think it's Kornhauser. He's a sports guy, him and Wilbaum, Kornhauser. And anyway, so
Michael Wilbaum.
Yes. Yep. And then I can't remember Kevin Kornhauser. I can't remember his first name, but anyway, every time. So Kornhauser does a podcast, and his podcasts are all about stories that are surrounded around sports, right? Like there's a story like, well, he actually came from this part of the city and he had practiced in this stadium at this time. And by golly, wasn't that so coincidental that he, connected with this coach? So he tells these stories, and it's one of the most popular sports podcasts. And it made sense to me that we should take a podcast that's about our own stories and experiences and how that fits into questions of people about what people have going on in their shops, the questions that they have that they're struggling with, and how can we make a story about what we've experienced, whether it be a success or a failure, but how can we make that about the audience member and then tie it into us telling a story about what we do in our shops.
So y'all do a fantastic job.
You do.
You're my third favorite podcast. I listen to the Village Church sermon. I listen to Life Church sermon, and then I listen to Woodshop Life.
Well, thank you guys. I'm happy I'm on that list. That's a good list.
You're my favorite woodshop podcast, though, man.
Awesome.
I love it.
Well, we appreciate you coming on the podcast. We'll call this one for the night, and I'm Will from Flat Woodworks.
And I'm Tom from Mountain Valley Maker.